Florence had a way of making you believe in beauty again. The narrow streets felt like a living painting, every stone holding centuries of secrets. Emily had wandered those streets many times before, but on this particular evening, as the sky burned orange over the Arno River, she stood frozen on the Ponte Vecchio, with a truth she could no longer outrun. The sound of water below was steady, almost hypnotic, yet her mind was anything but calm. She was thinking about him, the person she once would have sworn would never hurt her, the person who had looked her in the eyes and promised to protect her heart. The story she had been telling herself for weeks was unraveling. She had repeated the same soothing phrases to dull the sting. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he was under pressure. Maybe he didn't realize how much it would hurt. She had clung to those maybes because the alternative felt like a free fall into something too cruel to process. But standing there, watching the river carry away the last light of day, she realized something with bone-deep certainty. It had not been a mistake. It had been a choice. That realization is like stepping out of a warm bath into icy air. Your skin contracts. Your lungs forget how to pull in air. Your heart tries to convince your mind to go back inside where it's comfortable, where the lie still feels safe. But you can't unknow the truth. Once you see it, it stares back at you, unblinking. The human mind craves a softer story. It will twist reality until it fits the narrative that people are mostly good, that those we love would never knowingly cause us harm. It is easier to believe in clumsiness than in cruelty, but there comes a moment when the evidence is louder than your excuses. The message is written not just in their actions, but in the precision of their timing, the way they struck when your guard was down, the way they knew exactly which part of you to target. Emily replayed the moments in her head, the late night conversations where she confessed her fears, the way he had listened so intently, storing each vulnerability like a key he might need later. She had mistaken his curiosity for care. She had mistaken his attention for love. In reality, he had been mapping her soul so he could weaponize it. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. That night in Florence, Emily took the first step toward reclaiming that power. She couldn't change what had been done. She couldn't erase the deliberate nature of his betrayal. But she could stop rewriting the story to make it less painful. She could look it in the face and say, this was intentional, and because it was intentional, it cannot be excused. When you finally allow that truth in, there is a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief, because the person you thought you knew never really existed. Relief, because you no longer have to waste energy defending their intentions. You stop waiting for explanations. You stop hoping for a version of events that would make it all easier to swallow. You start living in the clarity of what is. Clarity is not gentle. It strips away the cushions you've been using to protect yourself from impact. But it is the only place where real healing begins. As long as you cling to the hope that the harm was accidental, you will feel obligated to keep the door unlocked, to give them another chance. And that is exactly what people who hurt you intentionally count on. Your hesitation, your hope, your need for a reason that doesn't break your heart. Think of it like standing in front of a dam with a growing crack. If you believe the crack came from a random rock slide, you might patch it and hope it holds. But if you discover someone has been chipping at it every night, knowing the flood it would cause, you wouldn't patch it. You would lock the gates, install guards, and never let them near it again. That is what truth does. It turns hesitation into certainty. Emily didn't become stronger that night by hardening her heart. She became stronger by refusing to lie to herself, by naming the harm for what it was. She stripped away its power to keep her stuck. That's the first act of self-respect. Stop giving someone the benefit of the doubt when they have already benefited from your doubt. If you've ever been in that place, if you've ever felt the shock of realizing it wasn't carelessness but calculation, you know how it changes everything. It demands a choice, not between forgiveness and vengeance, but between self-worth and self-abandonment. And the truth is, only one of those choices will set you free. If this message is hitting somewhere deep, subscribe to this channel so I can keep creating these conversations that speak to the parts of you you've been protecting. Your support helps me bring you more of the stories, tools, and truths that they never wanted you to realize. Now I have a question for you, and I want you to answer in the comments. If someone hurt you intentionally, would you A. give them another chance, because everyone makes mistakes? B. close the door for good to protect your peace? Type your answer, A or B, in the comments and tell me why you chose it. David had always been the kind of person who believed in second chances. Living in New York City had taught him to be patient with people. The city itself was a constant test of tolerance. Trains delayed without explanation, strangers brushing past you without apology, plans changing at the last second. In that environment, you learned to let small things go. You learned not to hold on to every little slip. But what David didn't realize for years was that there was a dangerous difference between forgiving an exception and tolerating a pattern. Josh had been his friend since college. They had been through countless late nights, job changes, relationships, starting and ending. David thought he knew Josh better than anyone. That's why, the first time Josh canceled on him for an important meeting they had planned for months, David didn't think much of it. Life happens. The second time, it stung a little more, but Josh's explanation seemed genuine. By the third, fourth, and fifth time, the sting had turned into something else. It was a heaviness in David's chest, a quiet suspicion that this was not bad luck. It was a habit. The trouble with patterns is that they rarely announce themselves. They creep in quietly, wrapped in charm or humor or convincing excuses. People will tell you what they value, but more than that, they will show you, and what they show consistently is the truth. Josh always had time for last-minute adventures with other friends, but when it came to David, somehow there was always a reason he couldn't make it. The Stoic philosophers often wrote about the importance of seeing things as they are, not as we wish them to be. Epictetus said, "If someone is not good for you, walk away." Simple words, but they cut to the heart of what David was facing. He had been defending Josh's actions by clinging to the good memories, by telling himself the history they shared meant the friendship was strong. But history is not the same as respect. The length of time someone has been in your life does not guarantee the quality of the way they treat you. David began to think of relationships like investments. A single bad trade can happen to anyone, and you can recover from it. But if you keep making the same losing trade over and over, your account will eventually be emptied. Every time Josh broke his word, David was making an emotional withdrawal. Every excuse was like paying interest on a debt that never seemed to shrink. He realized he had been investing in something that kept losing value. One night, after yet another canceled plan, David sat down and opened a blank notebook. At the top of the page, he wrote pattern tracker. He listed every time Josh had let him down in the past year, along with the reason given. Seeing it in black and white changed everything. This wasn't a string of isolated events. It was a rhythm, a consistent beat that told him where he stood in Josh's priorities. And the truth was hard to ignore. He was not at the top of the list. There is a painful kind of clarity that comes from seeing the pattern. It forces you to admit that you have been allowing it, that you have been part of the reason it continues. When you label something as a mistake, you give it room to happen again. When you name it as a pattern, you have to decide what you are willing to do about it. David didn't stop caring about Josh, but he stopped lying to himself about who Josh had shown himself to be. He stopped waiting for a different version of him to appear. It wasn't about punishing Josh or demanding apologies. It was about protecting his own time, his own energy, his own sense of worth. Patterns don't lie, they reveal priorities. And once you see the truth in someone's pattern, you face a choice. Keep tolerating it and teach them that this treatment is acceptable, or change the terms of their access to you. David chose the latter. It wasn't a dramatic ending. There were no big confrontations or speeches, just a gradual stepping back, a quiet shift in where he placed his energy. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop calling it a mistake when it is clearly a decision. Stop telling yourself that time alone can change someone's pattern. Time does not transform people who are committed to the same habits. Only their own decision to change can do that. Until then, your decision has to be about you, in the end. David learned something that the Stoics would have understood well. Life is too short and too precious to keep investing in what consistently depletes you. A single slip can be forgiven. A pattern demands a boundary. And boundaries, once drawn, have a way of protecting not just your time, but your peace of mind. In Kyoto, the air carried the soft fragrance of cherry blossoms drifting from trees that lined the narrow streets. Sophia sat on a wooden bench near a quiet temple garden, her notebook open on her lap. The petals fell around her like a gentle snowfall, landing on the page where she had written the first sentence. "I forgive you, but this is goodbye." Her hand lingered over the words, tracing them slowly, as if she needed to feel their weight before she could release them. Forgiveness had never been hard for Sophia. She had been raised to believe that forgiving meant letting people back into your life, that to forgive without reconciling was to hold on to bitterness. But life had taught her otherwise. It had shown her that forgiveness and re-entry are two entirely separate choices. One is about cleansing your own heart. The other is about granting someone access to it again. When the person she loved hurt her, she did what most people do. She searched for reasons to excuse it. She told herself that if she could just let go of her anger, things could return to the way they were. But the truth was, forgiving him in her heart didn't erase the reality that he had shown her exactly how little he valued her trust. She could release the pain, but that didn't mean she had to reopen the door. People often confuse the act of forgiveness with the decision to reconcile. It is one of the most dangerous misconceptions in relationships. Forgiveness is an internal process. It frees you from carrying the poison of resentment. It's for your peace, your clarity, your emotional freedom. Reconciliation is external. It requires evidence of change, accountability, and a willingness to rebuild trust. Without those things, reconciliation is not kindness. It is self-sabotaged. She watched a petal land in the still pond beside her. Sophia realized that she had been treating forgiveness like an invitation instead of what it truly was, a release. You can release someone from your anger without inviting them back into your life. You can wish them healing while keeping them far from the parts of you they once broke. Forgiving without re-entry is like cleansing your body after being poisoned. It is necessary for your survival, but survival also means never drinking from that same cup again. It's not cruelty to refuse the cup. It's wisdom. Sophia created a private ritual for herself. She called it the 3 gifts. First, she gifted herself peace by releasing the emotional debt. She no longer replayed the moments in her head, no longer searched for the perfect words that might have made him understand. Second, she gifted herself boundaries. She made a promise that her healed heart was no longer accessible to someone who had proven careless with it. Third, she gifted herself a future one free of the constant anxiety of wondering if the next day would bring another betrayal. The Stoics believed that peace is not found in changing others, but in mastering yourself. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Sophia saw how much of her suffering came from imagining a reconciliation that would never truly heal her. Letting go of that fantasy brought her more peace than holding on to the hope of restoration ever could. Some people will argue that if you truly forgive, you should be willing to reconcile. But those people confuse clarity with cruelty. True forgiveness does not mean pretending the harm never happened. It means remembering it with calm instead of pain. It means using the memory as a guide for the boundaries you now keep. Sophia knew that he might never understand why her forgiveness came without an open door, But his understanding was not her responsibility. Her responsibility was to herself, to honor the lessons she had learned at great emotional cost. She had given him trust once, freely. That was a gift. A second time would not be a gift. It would be negligence. In the quiet of that Kyoto garden, she closed her notebook and placed it beside her. She didn't need to send the letter. The act of writing it was enough. Forgiveness had been given. Access had not. For the first time in a long time, she felt light. She could look back without longing, think of him without bitterness, and walk forward without the burden of old wounds holding her back. You can forgive someone and still never let them back in. That is not a contradiction. That is emotional intelligence in its purest form. It is the discipline of protecting your peace while releasing your anger. It is the ability to love yourself enough to say, I wish you well from a distance you will never cross again. In Chicago, the wind seemed to cut through everything. It swept down the streets between the glass towers, carrying the sounds of traffic and the low hum of a city that never truly slept. Liam had always loved the rhythm of this place. It kept him alert, sharpened his instincts. But in his work life, there was one person who had learned how to slip past those instincts, to get what they wanted without ever asking outright. That person was Matt. Matt had a way of making his needs sound like your responsibility. It began with small things. A last-minute request for help on a project, framed as if you don't step in, we'll both look bad. An extra task dropped on Liam's desk with the words, I thought we were in this together. It felt harmless at first, even flattering in a way, to be seen as dependable. But over time, Liam began to notice the weight of it. Matt's kindness seemed to show up only when he wanted something. His friendliness faded as soon as the favor was done. This was not friendship, not even mutual respect. It was a strategy. The machinery of manipulation is often invisible until you step back far enough to see the moving parts. Liam started to pay closer attention, and the patterns emerged. There was guilt-tripping where Matt framed every refusal as a personal betrayal. There was breadcrumbing, offering vague promises of recognition or help in the future that never materialized. There was selective kindness, turning on charm when it served him and withdrawing it when it didn't. And there was where any attempt to confront him was met with a sad story or a subtle implication that Liam was being unfair. The Stoics taught that clarity begins with naming things as they truly are. Once Liam gave names to these tactics, they lost some of their power. He started thinking about his relationships in terms of emotional return on investment. How much energy was he putting in, and what was he actually receiving in return? When he ran the numbers in his mind, the math was clear. He was operating at a loss, and the deficit was growing. The danger of manipulation is that it makes you question your own boundaries. It pushes you into explaining and justifying yourself when you should simply be saying no. Matt's tactics worked because they appealed to Liam's sense of loyalty and fairness, twisting those values until they became tools against him. That is how manipulation thrives. It uses your strengths as leverage. One afternoon, after yet another conversation that left him uneasy, Liam decided to map it out. He took a sheet of paper and wrote down every interaction with Matt over the past month that had left him feeling drained or pressured. Next to each one, he identified the tactic used and the outcome. Seeing it laid out like that was like pulling back a curtain on a stage. The illusions fell apart. There was no genuine partnership here, only a calculated exchange where Matt ensured he always came out ahead. It would have been easy to respond with anger, to confront Matt and demand a change. But Liam understood something deeper. Confrontation often gives manipulators exactly what they want, a reaction they can spin, a reason to paint themselves as the wronged party. The real power lay in detachment. The moment you see the gears turning, you can choose not to step into the machine. Liam began making small shifts. He stopped over-explaining when he said no. He stopped accepting vague promises in place of real commitments. He stopped letting guilt decide his actions. Instead of fighting the manipulation directly, he starved it of fuel. Without his compliance, Matt's tactics had nowhere to land. The machinery of manipulation only runs when you feed it. It thrives on your explanations, your hope, your desire to be seen as fair or kind. Once you see it for what it is, you have the choice to disengage, quietly, without the drama manipulators expect. That is where emotional intelligence meets self-protection. By the time winter gave way to spring, Liam noticed the change in himself. The same city streets that once felt like a blur of obligations now felt open again. The weight on his shoulders was lighter, not because Matt had changed, but because Liam had stopped letting himself be a part of the game. The Stoics believed that mastery over your own mind is the only true form of control. Liam had learned that mastery sometimes means walking away from the stage entirely, leaving the performance to collapse without an audience. And once you've seen the machinery for what it is, you never forget the sound of it grinding to a halt. Olivia stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon, just as the first light of morning spilled across the red rock walls. The air was cool and sharp, the kind that makes you feel wide awake without a sip of coffee. In her pocket, her phone vibrated. Again. She knew without looking whose name would be on the screen. She also knew she would not answer. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The silence between her and that person was no longer an empty space. It was a decision. Silence has a reputation for weakness. People assume that if you don't respond, it must be because you have nothing to say, or you are afraid to speak. But Olivia understood that silence, when chosen intentionally, is one of the most powerful forms of communication. It does not mean you have surrendered. It means you have decided the battle is not worth fighting. This was not an impulsive choice. For months, she had tried to explain herself, to make her feelings understood, to defend her boundaries in words. That felt more like pleadings. Each conversation became a loop, the same accusations thrown at her, the same selective memory twisting the past into something unrecognizable. It was exhausting, and it was pointless. She remembered something her grandfather had once told her. You do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. The person who had hurt her wanted noise. They wanted a reaction they could grab onto, twist, and use, to keep the conflict alive. Olivia's anger, her explanations, her defense of it, had been currency in a game she never agreed to play. The turning point came one night when she sat alone on her apartment floor, phone in hand, reading yet another message filled with manipulative half-apologies and veiled accusations. She felt the familiar rush to respond, to correct the narrative before it could take root. Then something in her went still. She realized she could end the cycle without saying a single word. Silence is not absence. It is presence without participation. It says, I am here, but not for this. It denies the other person control, because it removes the fuel they need to keep the fire burning. That is why it feels so unbearable to those who rely on provocation. Without your reaction, their power dissolves. The Stoics valued restraint as the highest form of mastery. The best answer to anger is silence was not a call to be passive, but to be deliberate. Olivia saw that choosing silence was not about retreating. It was about protecting her energy from being drained into conflicts that could never be resolved in good faith. In the weeks that followed, she committed to what she called her personal no-contact challenge. 30 days of no replies, no explanations, no openings for the other person to step back into her life. At first, the silence felt heavy, like she was holding her breath. But slowly, that heaviness began to lift. She realized that every day she did not engage, she reclaimed a little more of herself. Silence gave her something she had not felt in a long time: peace. The kind that is not dependent on someone else's behavior. The kind that comes from knowing you no longer need to win the argument or change the other person's mind. It freed her from the endless cycle of defending her worth to someone who had already decided to overlook it. The person on the other end did not take it well. The messages became more frantic, alternating between anger and sentimentality, accusations and longing. It confirmed what Olivia had suspected all along. They did not want resolution. They wanted control, and control cannot survive in silence. What she learned in those quiet weeks stayed with her. Strategic silence is not coldness, it is clarity in action. It is the understanding that some conversations are not meant to be finished. Some stories are better left without an ending. And some people can only be understood when you finally stop giving them words to twist. Standing at the edge of the canyon, Olivia felt small against the vastness of the world. But her smallness did not feel powerless. It felt freeing. She could look out across the miles of rock and sky and know that she was no longer tethered to the noise she had left behind. She had not lost her voice. She had simply chosen not to waste it. When she turned away from the view, the phone buzzed again. She let it go unanswered, slipped it back into her pocket, and walked forward into the day. That was the real power of silence. It was not about closing her mouth. It was about opening her life to everything that had been waiting beyond the constant need to defend herself. In Santorini, mornings began in gold. The first light spilled over the whitewashed buildings and reflected off the blue domes, casting the whole island in a quiet glow. Noah stood on the balcony of a small villa overlooking the sea, a cup of coffee warming his hands. The world felt still in those moments, as if the island itself was holding its breath. He thought about how far he had come, not in miles but in the distance between the man he used to be and the man standing here now. The version of himself that had once tolerated chaos was gone. The one who had explained away disrespect, who had stayed in situations long past their breaking point, who had lowered his voice so someone else could feel taller, he no longer existed. Noah had rebuilt himself piece by piece, through nights of doubt and mornings of discipline. He had learned to protect his peace like it was the last light in a storm. That was why the thought of letting the same people who once fractured him back into this new life felt impossible. Access, Noah realized, is a form of currency. It has value. It is not something you give freely to anyone who asks, and it is not restored simply because someone says they are sorry. The healed version of you is the result of work, sacrifice, and time. Not everyone has earned the right to witness it, let alone touch it. Forgiveness might be free, but access is earned. He had learned that some people confuse healing with an open invitation. They believe that because you have moved on from the hurt, you should be willing to reopen the door. But healing does not erase memory. It does not rewrite history. It simply changes the way you carry it. Noah remembered everything. He remembered the exact moments when trust was broken, the words that had been twisted, the silences that had been used as weapons. Those memories were not anchors anymore, but they were signposts, and they reminded him that his peace was not to be gambled with. The Stoics taught that self-respect is a discipline, not a mood. It is the daily choice to honor your own worth. Noah understood that giving someone who had once destroyed that worth unrestricted access again would not be kindness, it would be regression. He had not climbed out of the pit to lie down in it. Again, there was a bitter sweetness to this kind of clarity. Part of him wished he could believe in their promises of change. Part of him wanted to believe that time and distance had transformed them into someone safe. But real growth shows itself in consistent action, not in declarations made when someone feels your absence, and he had seen no such actions. One evening, walking along the cliffs, he thought about the people who had stayed in his life through his healing. They had respected his boundaries without making him justify them. They had supported his growth without trying to pull him back into old roles. These relationships had deepened, not because they demanded access, but because they valued it. That was the difference. The ones who valued access treated it like the privilege it was. The ones who didn't had treated it like an entitlement. Until it was gone, Noah knew there would always be voices telling him to soften. to give another chance, to prove he had truly moved on by letting the past back in. But he also knew that peace is not passive, peace is active. It is built on choices that protect it from erosion. It is guarded by the walls you build from your own lessons. Looking out over the water, he felt the weight of those walls not as barriers that kept life out, but as the structure that held his life together. He no longer felt guilt for being harder to reach. He no longer apologized for being selective with his time. His healed self was not available to everyone, and that was exactly how it should be. When the sun dipped lower, painting the sea in shades of orange and red, Noah understood something he wished he had known years ago. You can love people and still deny them entry into your life. You can wish them well from a distance that keeps you safe. You can carry no anger and still carry strong boundaries. That is not cruelty. It is the highest form of respect for yourself and for the work it took to become who you are now. He turned from the balcony, the last light catching on the rim of his coffee cup, and felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. The healed version of himself was not up for negotiation. It was not a shared space. It belonged to him alone, and no matter who came knocking, no matter how familiar the voice on the other side of the door, he had the right to decide if it stayed shut. That was the final lesson the journey had given him. You do not owe anyone the new you, especially those who broke the old one. When you step back and look at the journey of these 6 people, you see a single thread connecting them all. Emily, in Florence, who stood on the Ponte Vecchio and faced the shattering truth that the harm done to her was no accident. David, in New York City, who learned to tell the difference between an isolated mistake and a destructive pattern. Sophia, in Kyoto, who understood that forgiveness could be a personal act of liberation without requiring re-entry into her life. Liam, in Chicago, who saw through the gears and levers of manipulation and learned to starve it of his energy. Olivia, at the Grand Canyon, who discovered that silence could be a deliberate form of power, not a sign of weakness. And Noah, in Santorini, who made the unshakable decision to guard the healed version of himself as if it were the most precious thing he owned. Together, their stories form a map of emotional self-protection, one that is drawn from lived experience, rather than theory. Each of them encountered a moment where they could no longer pretend the hurt they endured was accidental. Each faced the uncomfortable clarity of seeing someone's true nature, and each had to make a choice that, while painful in the moment, became a turning point toward a stronger, more peaceful life. Emily's awakening reminds us that the first step in protecting ourselves is naming the truth without softening it. When you stop pretending the knife slipped, you begin to understand where your boundaries must be drawn. David's quiet decision shows that loyalty has limits when it is consistently met with disregard, and that patterns once signed cannot be unseen. Sophia's cherry blossom moment teaches that you can let go of resentment without letting go of your boundaries. Forgiveness is not a welcome mat. It's a key you use to free yourself from the prison of bitterness. Liam's clear-eyed look at manipulation reminds us that people will use our best traits against us if we are not careful. Kindness without discernment becomes currency for the wrong hands. Olivia's silence shows that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to stop speaking entirely. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you refuse to waste your words where they will be twisted. And Noah's resolve in Santorini is the final chapter. Your healed self is a treasure, and not everyone is entitled to it simply because they once knew the broken version. The deeper lesson in their stories is that self-respect is not about walls. To keep people out, it is about the structure you build to keep yourself intact. It is about refusing to re-enter a fire you barely escaped, no matter how much someone insists the flames are gone. Protecting yourself from repeated harm is not selfish. It is an act of loyalty to the only life you have in the world we live. And today, this lesson is more relevant than ever. Relationships, whether personal or professional, are often complicated by constant communication. blurred boundaries, and the pressure to always give people another chance. We are told that kindness means being endlessly forgiving, that maturity means tolerating discomfort, that love means enduring more than we should. But if these 6 stories tell us anything, it is that discernment is just as important as compassion, that protecting your peace is just as noble as offering understanding, that walking away, when done from a place of clarity, is not a sign of bitterness, it is a sign of growth. Applying this in your own life means starting with self-awareness. Pay attention to patterns, not just apologies. Notice how people behave when there is nothing in it for them. Value actions over words, and consistency over promises. Learn to separate the act of forgiving from the decision to restore access. And most importantly, understand that boundaries are not punishments, they are the foundation for any healthy connection, including the one you have with yourself. When you feel the pull to let someone back in, ask yourself if their return would serve your healing or sabotage it. Ask if the person they are now is truly different from the person who caused the harm. And if you see that nothing has changed, remember Noah's lesson. The healed version of you does not have to be shared with the one who broke the old you. At its core, this is about making peace with the fact that not everyone is meant to walk with you through every chapter of your life. Some are meant to be teachers, and their lesson is in their absence. Some are meant to show you where your boundaries are, and some are meant to be left behind so you can walk forward lighter, clearer, and stronger. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in their place, would you believe in second chances? Or would you close the door for good once trust had been broken intentionally? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can see your perspective and join the conversation. If this story and its lessons spoke to you, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Your support is what keeps me creating content like this, sharing stories and insights that help you protect your peace and strengthen your spirit. The more we grow this space together, the more voices we can reach, and the more lives we can impact with the kind of clarity they may not even know they're searching for.